So I have updated the study guide with a final revision just to call out some important details about install methods. And, and I'd also like to walk through some additional information about the Slipstream, which is summarized in the changes that were posted in the study guide. So if you have an old version that has no revision number here, you'd want to discard that and use this version. Specifically, and I'm just, all right, I did want to double check this point. I think earlier in this module, we went to a lot of trouble to explain why an in-place upgrade is really problematic, right? Does anyone recall a walkthrough like this where I shared
Yes.
what it's like for an in-place upgrade? It is an option for installation. You know, you can keep your apps and then you can load on top, but then there's all sorts of extra hoops you have to go through, right? And it doesn't remove your bad applications, right? Everybody remembers this?
Yeah.
So once you finish upgrading the OS, then you have to finish upgrading all of your apps. Some of the previous version of apps don't work with new versions of the operating system and so on. Just wanted to be sure that we went to the extra trouble to show and share that piece of it. In this student learning objective here, where we talk about Slipstream, I wanted to basically explain a little more about that method. So we did include a text reference of, we included a text reference right over, yeah, so your study guide talks about some of the tools. And we did include a text reference in here in the, so if you click on this, you'll see this screen. This screen. And there's a lot of granular information here. This is the step-by-step reference that was used in previous years for students to perform their own Slipstream assignment. And since Microsoft started putting out whole new versions of the operating system each year, this has become more of a challenge. So full disclosure, Slipstream is still a valid option to update images with new updates so that you don't have to reload them after the operating system is installed. The basic process still works, and in a large organization, this would still be of interest, but I did not require students to attempt this as an assignment. What I want instead is for you to be familiar with the basic process. And I want to call out some key points along the way. You start off with an image, and in this case, what's shown is a 2019 server image, and this hasn't changed in quite a while. So on the Microsoft Azure Education website, those are free versions of the software operating system for educational purposes, and you receive a license to use that. But they don't update them like the paid versions that you'd get in a corporate environment or a government environment. And we'll talk about those options in just a minute. So you have an ISO that you downloaded to create a server. And on many of the websites and resources where you can get these, the image hasn't changed in years in some cases. So if you happen to need to replace a 2019 server with a 2019 server, the image file is many years old, and there have been hundreds of updates that have posted. So again, if you're a large organization or a government agency, using DISM to incorporate those updates into the image is still a valid method, but it's not as simple or as easy to do as it used to be. The main thing to understand is that you start with that image and you don't muck with the image directly itself. What you end up doing first is creating a copy of the image inside a temporary directory. So you create a temporary directory, you copy the contents inside of here, and you have to mount the image. And when you mount the image in PowerShell, then all of the contents inside can be ported out to this temporary directory. The temporary directory is used to build a Windows installation media data set, right? It's called WIM. So I've taken the trouble of summarizing these basic steps, and it's here in the new revision of the study guide. So you first mount the ISO to copy it into a temporary folder that DISM can use to create an offline Windows install media image. So whenever DISM is accessing an ISO file, it's one of the important interests in how it works is to perform certain functions on an install media image that's online or offline. And whenever you're running updates, you have to be offline. It's important to take the image that you're working with offline. Evidently, there are cases where the image is running live in a system center configuration manager or an automated install process across the network. So this tool, the important thing to remember with this tool is you're going to mount the image and then create an offline copy. And in that manner, the original image is not corrupted, because sometimes system administrators have one good copy of this thing and they don't want to corrupt it. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but it's just a best practice to create a temporary and then work with an offline copy instead of mucking with the one active copy that you would have on a server. Does that make sense? I haven't heard a response. Can someone unmute their microphone, and are you still with me?
Yeah, I'm with you.
Okay. So that offline image is called a Windows install media image, right? A WIM file. And then new updates are integrated into the WIM, and then they're written back out to build an entirely new and different ISO file. And that helps avoid all sorts of problems. But it's that concept that we're mounting the ISO, we're creating a temporary copy of it, and then taking it offline to integrate the updates, that those three basic steps are often what techs that are trying to perform slipstreaming just don't get about the process. And if you don't understand that, you know, these three steps are necessary before you integrate the updates to the WIM, you're going to get errors, and lots of really strange errors with very cryptic error codes, and it's really hard to understand which way is up. And much of the time when things aren't working, it's because these preliminary steps haven't been taken. And that's the part of slipstreaming that I want you to know. And I also wanted you to have this this handy reference in case you ever wanted to attempt it. Now, I think I did announce that if anyone was interested in trying to use this same reference to attempt the Slipstream update with your 2022 server, that depending on how far you got, you could share your the screen output and the results. Even if you run into a brick wall, I'd be willing to post additional credit if someone wants to take this series of tasks. The reason it's provided in a text file is so that you can copy and paste the commands. When you get a command like this, you can copy and paste the commands. Or you can update it based on your version of the ISO. So obviously it wouldn't be 2019 and an old 2019 version of install media. It would be a 2022 version. And so one of the things you do if you were interested in trying this out would be to, let's see here. Where do I have this? I have the install media. Is it in my temp folder? I've got this install media here, the 2022. There it is. There's the install media. Can everybody see this?
Yes.
So I would take this, I would highlight it, I would control click and copy it, and I'd come into my text reference and I'd substitute this file name for the one I just highlighted here, right? So, and you could work the same process and then see what comes. It would work best if you did this on your virtual machine in the server 2022 environment instead of on your Windows 11 or Windows 10 machine, because those versions of DISM tend to differ from the references that Microsoft is using online. In any case, I wanted to clarify the essentials about slipstreaming, and that's one way to make sure that you don't have to load all these updates after you install fresh operating system media. One of the very best ways to avoid this drill is to participate in a Microsoft open license program. So this is one aspect of operating system deployment with Microsoft that I thought was really worth talking about. So Microsoft goes to the trouble of putting out the latest versions of, they put out more frequently new versions of their install media. And if you have a half a dozen people or more in your organization, even if it's a nonprofit organization, Microsoft has a whole family of volume license options. So there are open license options for nonprofit organizations and for education. There's a volume license option for profit companies. There are volume license options for government agencies. And basically you're buying the operating system and the applications, any Microsoft product, for pennies on the dollar. You're not paying retail. And see, they've been doing this for a very long time, but the important point is that when you participate in a licensing agreement, you can purchase something called software assurance. And what software assurance means is that you have access to the latest current install images. So what are we saying? Microsoft goes to the trouble of incorporating these updates. So you can do slipstreaming yourself. and the tools are there. But if you participate in the open license program, a volume license program, you can go to the website and download, you know, this season's, you know, by the fall, they'll have another version or another updated ISO. So by the time we get to fall, they've already gone to the trouble of incorporating the latest system updates into those ISOs, and they've kind of done the hard work for you. The fact that you have software assurance means that anytime there's a new version of an operating system or an application, you have free rights to go to the Volume License Service Center, log in, and download your own ISOs. So if there's a new version of Office, a new version of SQL Server, a new version of Exchange email server, a new version of the System Center, or any of the server licenses, you just download them and then use them, and you don't have the extra legwork, you don't have the extra tasks to perform in order to take advantage of that concept. The idea that you can incorporate updates as you move along, right? Any questions about the Volume Licensing Service Center? And what it is, and why you would want to participate. I mean, you can go to Office Max and pay retail for licenses, but it's just, or go to Amazon and pay retail. But if you go direct, there are advantages. So now, when you're working with install tools, it's common to run into errors. And so one of the things that we wanted to take some time to call out from our study guide are the common steps that you would take to make sure that you know your install utilities and tools are running properly. One of the most common is that people don't run them as administrator. So when we talk about these methods up here, WinPE and DISM and sysprep, right? Sometimes when these aren't working right, it's because the command is executed in a window that isn't run as administrators, so you don't have administrative privileges. And again, the error messages are not always helpful. They don't always tell you these things. So that would be the first thing to do. Another thing is to make sure that your DNS is working properly. So a lot of times when names for systems, a lot of the install commands won't work right if the system names associated with a specific network address are muddled. So it helps to ensure that everybody has restarted their system, they've cleared the DNS cache, that the local DNS server has names for the hosts that match the network address. And typically, if network addresses are dynamically assigned, that creates huge problems. So what you'd want to do when you're working these methods, and you're staging these resources and building this stuff, you want to work with statically assigned or fixed IP addresses when you're working the commands. Does everybody understand what I mean by static or fixed addresses? So commands to install operating system operate with administrative authority, and there's an element of trust or a component of trust involved. And so part of this is you have to always run as administrator, but then the other piece of it is your network environment needs to clearly establish the local resources on the network so that those can be verified. And then Firewall rules. Oftentimes, install tools, operating installation tools will misfire because firewalls will get in the way. If you have remote management or remote management tools that are used for that installation process, and things aren't working correctly, much of the time, the firewalls will cause a problem. One good way to test to see if an installed tool is misfiring is to simply and temporarily disable the machine firewall to see if the tools run without a problem. And we see this a lot. The need for system and device security has become so extreme that a lot of interactions across the network are stomped flat, and it's because of some firewall updates with rules. So oftentimes there are critical dependencies. You can have a tool that works fine, but then when there's an operating system update, sometimes there are tool updates. So, and it's not uncommon to have to load a prior update or a previous version of something in order for it to work right. That should never be the case. Whenever you have, the kernel of an operating system updated, you would think all of the tools, all of the versions in the tools would be updated also, but in the workplace, that's not the reality. This is a big thing here. Has anyone ever seen the acronym LTSC? Does anyone know what that means?
No.
Okay. So one of the things that we have been talking about today is this notion that Microsoft will have new versions of the operating system available to their volume licensed customers before others in the general public. And if you're working a smaller environment and you need to rebuild systems and you want to include the updates, you can do the slipstreaming manually, right? So the other thing that is important to understand is that there are certain versions of the operating system that are intended for long-term support. So this acronym that you see here, that has to do with long-term support images. Sometimes Slipstream doesn't work, and sometimes the image that you need with the Volume License Center isn't available unless it's considered to be a long-term support image. When you're working with Linux, and there's a parallel kind of concept that plays out in the world of Linux. If you search for, has anybody here ever heard of Ubuntu?
Yeah, we installed it in the ACS tech class, or at
Right.
least I installed it from the textbook.
So in the world of Linux, the acronym stands for LTS, long-term support, right? So the folks who develop Linux, they'll claim when they have a stable version, they'll say, okay, it's 22.04, it's 22.04 that's the long-term support version. Now, you can get 22.1, 22.2, but the one that they'll support with considerable resources are specific version numbers. And the same thing holds true with the Volume License Center. Some versions of the operating system that people can load with a new feature update are not long-term support versions. And it's really important to understand that long-term contract, thought I had this open here. So there are certain versions for Windows 10. You've heard 22H2 before and 20H2. And so these are different flavors or different versions of the same operating system. With the volume licensing program, they designate some versions for long-term servicing channels. That means that the updates that come out each month are specifically engineered for those versions. That's why sometimes when you try to load an update, it doesn't work. If you have a home edition and you had access to the free version of Windows 11 when it came out, you bought your laptop when Windows 10 was, they were about to release Windows 11. You could get an early version of Windows 11, but it wasn't part of a corporate license. It wasn't part of a volume license. So what you find in some cases is that you have installation headaches, or you have installation update challenges because there's no account taken of whether or not the version you're using is an LTSC version, a long-term service version. So they have these other flavors of the operating system where users are entitled to updates for a time or for a season, like retail versions, hey, it's Christmas, but in February, when the new version of Windows comes out, you get a free upgrade, right? So semi-annual channels, that's another type of version of the operating system. And what Microsoft doesn't tell the general public is that when you're trying to work updates for one type of OS and you go to the update catalog, many times those are intended for a specific release that's been designated long-term service, right? So if you see LTS, that's Linux. If you see LTSC, that's Microsoft. And it's important to understand that sometimes you have problems with install errors because you're not working with the right version for the tools that you have and the environment you're in. If you are part of a volume license program, you should be working with LTSC versions of the images. And again, that's where being a part of the volume license program is so helpful. So if you're scratching your head trying to figure out why slips, hey, I have this update, it's a critical update. The March update for Windows 11 is serious. The March update for Windows 11 resolves, I was just reading 35 or 37 security flaws. And so everybody wants to update those security flaws, but if you want to incorporate January and February and March and April, if you're doing it manually, be sure you're using the LTSC versions if that's what you're doing in your organization. And better yet, if you haven't considered participating in the volume license program, that's really where a lot of this stuff just works better. And so if you experience a lot of trouble in smaller environments trying to do the things that we're reviewing in class here, it may be a simple matter that it's the semi-annual channel and you're eligible for an upgrade and it's a feature update and it doesn't load like it's supposed to and it keeps failing. Well, that's because it's the SAC version of this thing and you're on LTSC or vice versa. And I thought it was important to take the time to call this out. There is one more thing I wanted to nail home. Whenever you're dealing with DISM, you're always working with the operating system install media files. All you're doing is working with the OS files that you need to load the OS. That's it. So DISM is a tool that helps you manage and update and troubleshoot install media files when you're getting ready to install the operating system. SysPrep, that's a different animal altogether. It builds an image from a fully configured system that has all the applications installed. You know, the hard drive is already set up. So an ISO file is 5 or 6 gigabytes maximum. A SysPrep image can be 100 gigs large, 100 gigabytes large, right? So whenever you're dealing with SysPrep, it's not a system where you're just loading the operating system and then you have other things you have to do to it. It's ready to go and ready to, you know, to hook up and turn on in someone's office, and they have all the applications and software, all of the logins, all of the printers. You know, there's if you have to update an office image for a government agency or a corporation, you build a 100 gigabyte image here, and we've already told you can blast, you know, dozens or hundreds of computers all at once across a network. And that, of course, is it slows your network down, but you're building fully configured systems. So nobody has to go in behind them and set up printer drivers. Nobody has to go behind them and install Office or Adobe Acrobat Reader or you know, the favorite apps that are used by everybody in the office. If you're doing this, all you're doing is loading the operating system on a bare hard disk. So there's a huge difference between these install tools when it comes to context. This one's used for the simplest and most basic installation from bare metal. If you had a brand new machine and nothing was loaded. This one is used after you've gone through all the trouble to test with your users. You know, all right, so you need AutoCAD, you need, let's say you have an engineering department, a research and development department. Let's say you have, they would need AutoCAD, so they would helps them draw diagrams of things that are built in the factory or with 3D printers. If you were working anything that had to do with location interests like law enforcement, GPS, right? GPS. GPS software would be configured and installed and ready to go. So those are tremendous ways to save a lot of work, but there's more to it, and there's more tasks going into that kind of operating system installation. So this would be the most basic case, this would be the most advanced case. And you could use this image with WDS or with System Center Configuration Manager, SCCM. Are there any questions about what we've covered with the update here in our study guide? Okay.